Well, I am a Midwesterner. I grew up in Wisconsin, a small town. I've always been very grateful for having grown up in a place where people were very nice. And I really think that has had a big influence in lots of things I've done in my life, lots of choices I made about what to do, and really still choices I make every day. My father used to say all the time about me that, oh, just give Lisa a piece of paper and a pen and she'll go entertain herself for hours. I mean, I was a very quiet, introverted, introspective, and a kid who could do just about anything and entertain myself for a long time. I am a lifelong student, and I was always a very curious student. I did well, not because I'm really smart. I'm probably average, but I am very curious, and I work very hard. And my parents were extremely hardworking, and we're also very curious. Neither of them went to college, but my mother is an avid reader. My father was very curious and did a lot of things with his hands and did a lot of creation. He created things, made things. And so my family was just, always very curious and supported that. My grandmother was a huge influence in my life in terms of academics. She was a professor of sociology, and I would love to go to her apartment, and she had books everywhere, and it was quiet, and she'd take me to the art museum, and so I had a lot of great influence in terms of school and studying, and really loved learning, still do. I always thought I would go to college, but since my parents didn't, and they were not, that was just not really in kind of the plan of all four of us kids. I thought I would go, but I didn't really know what it meant or how I would get there. I just thought that's what I would do. But I had a terrible experience. And this was, the early 80s. And I went into my guidance counselor, who was a very nice man and, probably had a master's in education or something, counseling. And I said, I think he's like, "You're going to go to college?" "Yes, I want to go to college. I need some help in figuring out where to go and how to apply and how to get money to do it," because, that was something I had to figure out. And he said, "So, okay, what you probably need to go to state school then. What would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm really thinking about something like engineering. I'm good at math. I'm good at science. My chemistry teacher says this is, probably something I could easily pursue." And he said, "Well, Lisa, if you go to the engineering school, there's a lot of boys there. There are a lot of boys there, and really you're going to be like, there's one girl for every 7 boys. Is that something you really, feel like you could handle and want to do? It's really hard. Maybe you should consider being a teacher or a social worker." And I thought, oh gosh, like maybe I shouldn't. I don't, and I thought, well, okay. Maybe that wouldn't be a good idea. So I went home and reconsidered it and ended up not going to school for engineering. I don't regret that because my path is perfect, turned out exactly, and it wouldn't have been the same, but turned out exactly as I'd like it to have been. But I think back to that, and I have a very clear memory of that, and I think back to that, and I think, the influence someone has in that situation, and you don't know how much influence you have. And that conversation changed my life. Now, it turns out it changed it for way probably the better, but wow. And I was astonished. I tell people this story and they say, that just is amazing. And it wasn't like it was the 50s. So there was a lot of consternation after I finished. I did an individualized major in my undergraduate because I really liked science, but I was this kind of nagging about maybe I should do something that girls do, like be a social worker. So I did biology and social work together and finished and couldn't really decide what to do with that. But I did get a good job, and I met my very first person who had a master's in public health. She had an MPH, and she worked at a clinic that I worked at doing health education. And I remember seeing, this is so funny because it was like in the early 80s, and I remember seeing her degree, I think her name was Barbara, something MPH. And I was like, MPH? I mean, what kind of degree is that? Like, she make that up? Like, it's not an MS or an MA. I mean, I wonder where she got that, what mail order school she got that from. So I got the courage, she had her own office and she was kind of high up there in the ranks. So I got the courage to go ask her about her degree. And she told me it was a master's in public health. And I said, wow, that sounds cool. What's public health? So she explained to me what public health was and what her degree was and what she did at our organization. And I was captivated. This was 2 weeks after I started. And I went in, I asked my boss, could I please work with her? Because I am intrigued by what she's doing. I think I could contribute. And I ended up kind of taking that for the first time, really feeling like I took control of what I was doing, changed the course of my career, and ended up just loving it, and went back, did a PhD in public health, and then later, did some work in ethics, which we can talk about a bit. But it was fantastic. Really did wonders for the rest of my career and how I ended up where I am now. The thing that she was doing at the time was a confluence of all the things that mattered to me. It was 1985. It was the year that that FDA had just approved the HIV test. So to keep the blood tests or the blood supply safe, the HIV test was approved to test the blood supply and ensure that HIV would not be transmitted through blood supply. And they decided that in the interest of ensuring that people didn't go donate blood to try to find out if they had HIV, that they would actually set up counseling and testing sites where people could go separate from blood donation and get tested for HIV. And so she was working, doing HIV education and talking about HIV testing. And so, I thought, oh, that is, an amazing thing. We had to talk about things, one, that people didn't like to talk about. And I was a little bit in your face at that time that, 20-year-olds can be. So I loved that part of it. Second, it was dealing with, at the time, people who were really shunned. People who used drugs, people who, had sex with the same sex, who were shunned socially, people who potentially could have lost their insurance, job, social status, and, all kinds of things. And I've always been a person for the underdog. I'm always like, it doesn't even matter what the thing is. I always want the losing team to win. I always want the smallest kid to be picked first. I've been like that forever. And it just really pulled me. So this idea that it, was people with less social capital than others, and there was some way to help that it was about things that people thought you shouldn't talk about at the dinner table, or actually with your relatives or whatever, dinner table or not. And so those two things, and also I felt like it was such a great need. So, and there were so few people willing to kind of step up to the plate. So I thought those three things were really, the confluence of those three things really attracted me. And when I think about all the things that I really like about the work I've done over the last 20 years in public health and in ethics, those are the qualities of the kind of work I like. So I think that's really what jazzed me about it. I had a friend who lived in Denver, and I thought, oh, it's beautiful there. It's a big city. Well, okay. At the time, it seemed huge compared to my little town of 1,500. And so I packed up my little Dodge Charger and my little U-Haul. A friend and I took $2,000 that we had saved for the year, drove across the country. It was an amazing adventure. No job, nothing. We just said, well, let's go do something and see what we can make of it. So we did. And, I got a job shortly thereafter at the health department. And because of my experience with this, I really was passionate about doing HIV work, and they had, had a great program and had really interesting public health work going on there. And so I just was able to land a job there. And I ran into a woman who was doing some really cool work with HIV prevention. So I had done counseling and testing, and this is the point where people are scared. They're either, at that time, they were either worried, well, like no reason to worry that you have HIV, but they wanted to be sure they didn't, or people who knew they did and they just, it was too late to do anything about it. And what I was hoping for was something in that area that, well, maybe people who are afraid, they might be at risk, and maybe we could teach them how to do something different. So I was really interested in HIV prevention. It was an intervention study where we would actually do counseling sessions with people who were at a place where they had been in a risk situation. So they were diagnosed with an STD, for example, a sexually transmitted disease that wasn't HIV, but it was clear that if their partner had HIV, this could have been their STD, not gonorrhea, say, or chlamydia. Not one that was curable, but instead HIV. So catching people while they were at a vulnerable spot and then educating them about how important it is. This could have been your risk, but it wasn't, thank goodness, and moving them forward. So we started this research study really at the very start, protocol writing. We designed the intervention, and we recruited subjects. I mean, we just did the thing from the beginning, and it was so much fun. The creativity of thinking about what the study design would be, how we could randomize people, and what the best design would be, and then what the best intervention would be, how we could measure effectiveness, and what statistical analyses we do. And it combined for me both this passion and spirit part with this analytic part that I liked, that I was kind of left behind after the engineering conversation and all those years before. And I thought, wow, this could be the perfect way to put together my creative skills and interests and my analytic skills. And so I hung out doing that for a couple of years. And it was pretty clear that if I didn't get an advanced degree, I would be doing other people's work my whole life. And that would be fine, except, I always have this thing about, I probably could think about a better way to do it. So I gave into that, and I went back to school, and that's when I came to the East Coast, and I went to Hopkins, and I did a PhD, and I really, really loved the combination of the creativity and the qualitative kind of analyses where you can really talk to people about how they're feeling and what's going on, and the quantitative analysis. And I did epidemiology and demography, and I had a great run at it, and a really good many years, 15 years or so, at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where I did HIV research and surveillance, and was able to work on some amazing projects, and loved that balance of creativity and being able to kind of answer to that spirit, that need for help, that person who'd stand in when no one else would, working for the underdog, and then being able to tap into that quantitative piece too. I would say that when I was young and I would hear about research, I used to think that it was the truth and the fact and the finding. And if you just had the research result, then that would be what was true. And I thought that for a long time, really. This is almost embarrassing, but naively, until I actually started doing research with this principal investigator with whom I first worked. And I recall the messiness of it really surprising me. And not the messiness that the science was messy, but just that the process of science was iterative and interesting, and the feedback loop was really cool, and that we learn a little bit at a time, and we actually are swimming our way a bit at a time toward a truth, and the truth, we hope, but a study is not the truth. And I still go in the world, and when I'm interacting with non-scientists, I hear people say, well, they found that if you eat 7 carrots at every meal, you will have perfect eyesight when you're 80. And I think, I can't believe someone just said that and believes that, but that was me. And, not that, before I ever was introduced to research, I could have imagined myself saying something like that. So I think it used to be so simple and so clear and so easy. And then when you start doing science, it actually gets pretty fun because it's not that. I mean, I love the pursuit of knowledge. I love the ability to get closer and closer and closer through this iterative process of science, and all the things that make science and all the things that make research really interesting, including not just thinking about how to do cool studies, but communicating science in a way that people understand it. And people meaning, yes, the general public, but also fellow scientists so they can use it to take the science to the next step. Ensuring that we do valid science so we don't send our colleagues down some road that's not very productive. And people who use our science don't then end up producing a bunch of stuff that takes science in a different way that's not useful. And also, really of late, for the last 10 years of my career, the importance of really doing ethical science. And by ethical science, I don't mean just, I mean this, but not just, it's necessary but not sufficient. The research ethics, ensuring protection of human participants and ensuring people are treated with respect, and that's clearly really important, but that's not enough. There are so many other parts of ethical science that matter, including things like ensuring that people who do science have a really solid sense of professional ethics, that they perform their science and their research ethically, but then that they think about the implications of what they're doing, that their sense of moral imagination about the societal impacts of what they started in the first place is there and stimulated and matters. So, all of that is much more complex and much richer than I ever imagined when I first started thinking about what research was. I thought it was just a way to get to the answer, but it's fascinating and much more interesting than that. As an epidemiologist, it's interesting. Epidemiologists study, disease occurrence and patterns of diseases or preconditions of diseases or predispositions, risk factors of diseases in populations or communities. We separate ourselves from clinicians in the sense that we don't do clinical medicine one-on-one type of looks at diseases and such. We're really looking at health of a community, health of a population, and predictors of health. So I was very interested in infectious disease epidemiology from my work with HIV and other, sexually transmitted diseases, as well as other infectious diseases like tuberculosis and such, flu, etc. And my work revolves really around, when I was studying epidemiology, I was studying reproductive epidemiology and specifically the intersection between reproduction and HIV. So I was very interested in how women with HIV do a number of things. One, whether physiologically their reproduction was affected by HIV. Socially, whether their reproduction was affected by HIV. And ethically, morally, was their reproduction affected by HIV. So I can't think of a better, confluence of my interests than that. So, when I was in graduate school and I was doing my dissertation, I was working with a wonderful man who I adore, and his wife, who've done fantastic work in the Rakai district, and they've done an enormous amount of reproductive epi around women with HIV, and we were interested whether this was an African phenomenon or whether this was broader. And so I did some similar work that they did in Africa, in the U.S., and we found amazing similarities, recognizing that in fact it's probably more of a biologic than a social phenomenon. So it was really exciting work, and talked a lot about all the things that it meant and how this mattered to women. And then I went on to CDC and did a lot of work with infectious diseases, HIV, TB, continued to do those kinds of things. And, it takes about, maybe 2 or 3 weeks working in that field before the ethical issues start to lap up. And, you think about things like equity, justice, think about things like what you're doing if you can describe a horrible, deadly, terminal disease, but you can't do a darn thing about it. There are just all these things that come up. And so it didn't take long before the epidemiologist alone wasn't enough for me, which is why the public health ethicist part came really quickly. And I had the great fortune of working with some amazing mentors at CDC, people who were, both CDC staff as well as people who were brought in to assist CDC in some real ethical pickles, some tough situations where they, had to think carefully about use of data. This stems a little bit from the importance of knowing about a disease. So I worked for many, many years as a surveillance scientist. This is a person who collects information. Public health surveillance, we collect information on disease occurrence. This happens at the state level, and it happens, it's kind of data collection in the background. When a person is diagnosed with an infectious disease, there are state laws that require a care provider to report that to a state health department. Many infectious diseases, this is the case. Some cancers, so some non-infectious diseases as well. I worked with HIV and tuberculosis. So HIV specifically, clearly in the early days of HIV in the 80s and 90s, when stigma was, still a problem, but when it was a real, problem where people were getting fired, getting evicted, housing was a huge issue. People were afraid to stand by people with HIV or, be in the same room with people with HIV. People got their houses burned down because they had HIV. Real severe, life-threatening stigma. We worked very carefully because this is data collection in the background where individual people don't have a choice about whether their data are collected, and they get collected by the state health department. They're then sent to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, de-identified, sent to this wider national data set. I worked on that system, and as a person who believes very strongly in privacy and has very, I've always been an extremely active in this idea that, people should have privacy. It seemed like a bit of a conundrum for me or a paradox for me to be really clear about people having reproductive and health privacy, and then being extremely supportive of good data coming in on HIV, something as controversial and stigmatizing as HIV. So it was for everyone who worked on this. And we ended up really working hard to get national HIV reporting. And this was controversial and very difficult in the 90s, primarily because people on whom the data were collected were afraid. Were afraid of the government having their name when they weren't sick, when there was nothing anyone could do for them. And they would be sitting in a database for what? Nothing good was going to come to them from it. Nothing, they were going to get absolutely nothing from it. Where was the justice in that was the question. Where was my benefit? Where's beneficence in this? Where's my autonomy? So we talk about all these terms around ethics and people saying, where's my choice? Where's my consent here? All of which, for me was like, wow, I really have to make peace with this for myself, because I'm a person who believes in all those things. Like, that would be me talking if I didn't believe so firmly and so deeply in the idea that data gets us what we need. And how HIV data got us what we needed then was it got us money from Congress, and for each state, it got each state the portion of the pie Congress gave us for prevention and control. If people were unwilling to be counted, if HIV was going to remain an ignored, a silent, a covered up, an undercover, an ignored disease, we would never get money to treat, to do prevention, to get life-saving medications, and people would be hurt by that. People with HIV would continue to be stigmatized. They would continue to be left from removed from their homes. They would continue to suffer from great injustice. So it was this time to really try for me to make peace with and cope with this tension between how we do what we know we have to do to get the benefits of the funding and the attention and of this devastating, life-altering disease that takes the most productive years of a person's life, and the trade-off. And the only thing that assured me that the trade-off was worth it was that it was me and people like me doing the surveillance work. Like, I'm the one who has your data. If anyone tries to use these data in a way that I'm not okay with, they're up in flames. I mean, we're okay. You're good, because I'll burn the house down with the data. I mean, we're not going to let that happen. So it was a long 10-year slog to get this to happen, but with really effective community engagement, with people who were in the community working hard to help people understand what the uses of the data were, how they were protected, with really working closely with legislatures across the country to help put laws in place that these data could not be subpoenaed or used for reasons other than public health. It was slowly, domino by domino, it happened, and it ended up being what it took to get HIV services everywhere, where we had personnel in every single state, CDC funded personnel in every single state, at least one person and many more in high morbidity states, to do HIV data collection, to work on HIV, distribution of funds, et cetera. And no other disease has had that. And it's because we had good data, accurate, valid data, and complete surveillance information. To make sure that those data were protected and all those things that I talked about in terms of the ethical issues, that privacy was protected, that people felt engaged and in control of what was happening, and by people, I mean people in the community, we had to do a lot of work in ethics. And we had the privilege of working with, all the amazing people who do this work. Larry Gostin, who is an amazing, prolific lawyer and ethicist, public health lawyer, who worked with CDC to really think through what are the principles that we need to put forward, that all health departments, that legislatures need to think about in terms of keeping people safe. And by keeping people safe, I mean keeping their data safe. And we made some pretty amazing headway. And it was about the most satisfying decade of my life in terms of my professional work. And the folks who continue to carry that work on, are a couple people, Pat Sweeney, who's still in HIV doing this work, is amazing. Kevin Fenton, who has since left CDC and gone to the United Kingdom. I mean, just amazing people who, gave up years of their lives willingly and lovingly to ensure that what we were doing in public health was done ethically. And it's stuff like that I think we can't do public health every day, no matter what part of public health we do. We can't really do it without really considering this broad scope that I was talking about before of ethics. Much more, public health is research and practice, and we talk a lot about research ethics. And when you ask people about ethics, they say, oh, human subjects, IRB, blah, blah, blah. Some people say IRB, they have a bad experience, or some people say, oh, I'm on an IRB. Research ethics is really important, but again, it's one slice. There are all these other pieces of ethics that come into play that are critical for us to do the whole spectrum of public health well. And to do the whole spectrum of healthcare well. Public health is one slice of that bigger healthcare pie. So I do think it's time, and in part this is because of these three hats I've worn, and I continue to wear. I do think it's time to really open up this conversation this ethics conversation to include things like, how do we ensure that ethics is infused in everything we do from the start? We don't want to be in a situation where the IRB is viewed as the obstacle. We all know that that's how many people view an IRB. We don't want to be viewed as the ethics police or the stop sign ethics or the red light ethics. We really want to be viewed as a member of the research team, a member of the practice team, people who think things through from an ethical perspective can add so much to ensuring that research gets done well, creatively, ethically, scientifically sound. All of those are values we really appreciate in public health and medicine and research, in science in general. And if we put that in from the start, the ethicists and the ethics can help facilitate ethical research, not stop it. So making sure that we raise good scientists, meaning we have, ensure that scientists think ethically and that they have access to people who think ethically and can help them put that spin and flavor on what they're doing, ensuring that the research ethics are good, and then ensuring that we're all thinking about how what we do matters. Even for bench scientists, laboratory scientists. I mean, they're doing something important or they wouldn't be doing it. And certainly bench scientists in public health and health research are doing it because they think someday it's going to have some impact. Well, let's talk about that impact, and let's think about not just, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we could fill in the blank, but let's think about what the societal and ethical implications are of that project or that protocol. So broadening our view of what ethics is and how it helps us do quality research and practice, I think is really, it's time for us to go there. I spent a lot of time at CDC doing ethics work, kind of in addition to the epidemiology and the surveillance work I was doing, and in part just because of what I talked about, that doing all the science, you just couldn't help but run into these things, and they just stirred me. So I was just attracted to them. So I did the science plus that. And so it was interesting when the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, or the Bioethics Commission, they received a charge from the Secretary of Health and Human Services to look at evaluating or look at the ethical considerations of doing medical countermeasure research with children. So this means specifically they were asked to evaluate the ethical contours of doing anthrax vaccine trials with children, even though there's no indication for that yet. The only indication would be if we had a bioterrorism attack of weaponized anthrax. Okay, anthrax exists in nature, but the weaponized is the inhalational. It's a whole different kind of story. So there was a board that said, a science board that said, well, we should do it because we don't have any data in children, but the ethics are kind of crazy, and so maybe what we should do is they're complicated, and maybe what we would recommend we do a trial, but somebody needs to look at the ethics. So the secretary asked the commission to look at that, and I saw that this came out while I was at CDC, and I contacted the woman who was the executive director. And I said, wow, this looks pretty cool. And I went up and talked to them and said, I'm at CDC, I'm an ethicist, I do epidemiology, I know about research and I know about medical countermeasures. I had done some work with preparedness and dual-use research and other things in my career there at CDC. And it happened at that time she was returning, she was on detail, she was returning to her job, and the executive director position was opening, and we hit it off really well. She's great, and the staff there was fantastic, and so we ended up talking about my taking on that position. So it worked out. Lots government stuff happens in the black box, and it worked out that it was a secretarial appointment, and I moved up there and actually took on this job. And so every job I have, I think, wow, this is the most amazing job I've ever had. I love this opportunity. I'm learning so much. And again, I get to this job and I think, this is an amazing job. And I really must say, this is the most amazing job I've had. So here I am, again, at the most amazing job I've ever had. But the beauty of this job, I mean, I have the privilege, and it is an enormous privilege, of working with an august group of, started as 13, now we're 11, commission members who were, appointed by the President of the United States because they're brilliant and thoughtful and reflective, and they were appointed by him to, take on ethical considerations of technology, science, medicine, healthcare, ensuring that as we move forward in these areas as a country, we do it ethically. I mean, I don't know who would not just get, the hair on the back of my neck stands up around this, it's just, so we're chaired by an amazing woman, Amy Gutman, who's the president of the University of Pennsylvania. She's a, political scientist by training, and an amazing leader and an inspiration. And we have, philosophers and scientists and physicians, and we're vice chaired by an engineer, Jim Wagner. Could have been me, if not for my guidance counselor. Just really amazing people, researchers, and this group is phenomenal. Not only are they all very smart and have incredible careers of their own, when I first saw who was nominated and going to be on this commission, I thought, this was before I had anything to do with it. I still have the little tear out from Science magazine where it said Obama announces his new commission, and are they cool or what? I thought, and then a year and a half later when I went up there, I brought that little thing with me. It's so cute. But so not only are they super smart and really amazing, they're all really nice people. They're people I've read through my career, and then to actually, email them, talk to them, chat with them, know them, it's really quite an honor. So that's amazing. And then, so amazing upward. And then to work with them, to talk with them, to listen to their ideas, to hear them deliberate about questions that, come to a presidential commission. These are not questions where, they're easy enough that if we knew the answer, they clearly wouldn't come to this commission. These are tough ethical conundrums that come to this commission. So to hear them deliberate about that, and to think when we first get a question or an assignment from the president or someone from his cabinet, I think, oh my goodness, what, how are we ever going to get to the end of this? And then to watch that process unfold, it's really beautiful. It's how scientists say when they see something under a microscope and it's just beautiful, or through a telescope and they say, oh, the heavens are beautiful. It's kind of like when I watch this process, it's just an amazing process to watch this over time. We have a total of 7 projects the commission has. So they started their first project several before I got there, but their first one was synthetic biology, issues associated with this new technology. So that was the first one. The second one was an ethical analysis of the STD trials that were done studies that were done in Guatemala in the 40s. So while syphilis study in Tuskegee was happening here in the 40s through the 70s, there were similar studies, although somewhat different, but similar same investigators and some similar STD studies going on in Guatemala, in prisons, among commercial sex workers, among soldiers and such, some inoculations, some just really horrible studies occurring. They were discovered in the 2000s, brought to light in 2010, and then the president asked this commission to do an ethical analysis and look into what happened there. So they spent a lot of time poring through documents and investigating what actually happened there. At the same time, he asked them to examine the current research, the current protections for research participants in the U.S. now. and abroad. And so the research we do abroad. And so we had a panel, an international research panel, where we had a subcommittee where we brought experts in from all across the world and looked at how the U.S. protects participants and made 14 recommendations about how to improve the system, but found that fundamentally 45 CFR 46, the common rule, the IRB laws, called different things, fundamentally does a good job protecting research participants. Following that, we did a report on whole genome sequencing and privacy. So this is, another new technology similar to synthetic biology, a new technology, something coming that, while the ethical issues are similar, we're always talking about things like privacy and security of data and a person's autonomy, consent. We're talking about research ethics. We might also be talking about social implications for things. The topic about which we talk about this with can vary. So new technologies is a very common theme. Synthetic biology, this whole genome sequencing and such. And then we also did the medical countermeasures one, which I just talked about. That was our last report, in which the commission had to really wrangle with, what do we do when the threat is unclear, it's unknowable or unknown, and how willing are we to put children at risk, vulnerable populations generally, but children specifically, at risk for harm for a benefit we don't even know is ever going to be realized. In fact, we hope it's never realized. I mean, we hope we never have to use the results of this research, right? We hope we don't ever have a weaponized anthrax attack and children get affected, but they might. And so we have to balance, or there's this tension between this duty the government owes to research participants, especially vulnerable ones, like children, to protect them to the full extent possible, with this other duty the government has to be fully prepared in case of an attack. Right? And those two things are in conflict in this situation. So a very, very difficult, far and away, our chair says, and Dr. Gutman says, far and away the most challenging question and assignment any commission has ever gotten. This is one that really took a lot out of all of us. Currently, we're working on a report on incidental findings, the ethical issues associated with findings that either are not part of what someone's looking for, in several different contexts, not just the research context where they come up a lot, but also the clinical context, and then the growing area where there's not been very much work in the direct-to-consumer context. This idea where you can get, for entertainment purposes only, 3D ultrasound of your baby, or a whole body scan to see if there's anything wrong with you inside. So what to do in that situation when you get these findings. And then we also just got our most recent assignment, which is on neuro technologies and the ethics associated with that. So the amazing thing about this group, both the commission and then also the amazing staff that we have working for this commission, is that, it's not a single issue group. We have to be agile, flexible, and know a lot about a lot of things. So we're really fortunate that we get great assistance from really smart people who are working in these fields and come to testify and help teach us about what's going on. I mean, the Belmont Report, as we know, is just, it's one of these simple, elegant, short, to the point, will be relied on forever kind of reports. Its simplicity and its elegance make it exceedingly useful. It's hard to argue with respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. I mean, those will never go out of favor, I'm sure. I do think that some of these new technologies and our current problems that we face in medicine, science, and engineering and other moving healthcare forward bring us some new challenges that we need to think about or frame with some other kinds of concepts, particularly things like intellectual freedom, for example. This one of the principles that the Commission felt strongly about in their synthetic biology and the new technologies report was, how do we ensure that scientists have the freedom to do what they need to do intellectually and create? And, I was talking before about being, kind of jazzed about the creative, and this is exceedingly important for science. If scientists can't be energized by their creativity, they're not going to do well. I mean, they can't do good work if they're not creating and thinking and letting things happen. And so the intellectual freedom, which also comes with responsibility, clearly, that is a principle they've relied a lot on throughout the new technologies reports, including the privacy and whole genome sequencing. So that's something I think that, while it didn't come up really that much in the Belmont report, is really something we think a lot about. And then, given that we live in a time where there are a lot of laws and there are a lot of regulations and there's a lot of restriction, we also, the Commission really feels that a big part of that intellectual freedom and responsibility is this idea of regulatory parsimony, that we have as few regulations and that the regulations we do have are as little as they need to be, as least hampering as they need to be to ensure that the science is done in an ethical and positive way. So I do think that as we move forward, we'll find some need for additional principles, but it's hard to argue with ethics, which has been around for over 2,000 years. I mean, in the 1890s, when we were talking about, Warren and Brandeis had a groundbreaking article about privacy and new technologies, which we just put 2 reports out about that in the 2000s. So, and what they were talking about was photography and printing, right? All of a sudden, there was hysteria that all of your privacy is out the window because someone can take a photograph of you and print it and distribute it to lots and lots of people. I can't imagine what they would have said had they discovered the internet by then, had Facebook to contend with. But, so the issues are the same. It's just that right now we have the speed with which things are distributed and the the impossibility of reeling anything back. I mean, these are new twists that I think we will contend with, that might involve having to think about new considerations. There are 2 ways to become ethical. You're either born with it or you learn it. People have really different ideas about that. The Aristotelians would say, you work, you learn. You become virtuous by working to be virtuous. You practice. You, like anything, you work at it. Other people say you're born good or you're born bad. Most of us are born good, and there are a few bad seeds. I mean, there's a wide range. I personally happen to believe there's somewhere in the middle. I think most people are, genuinely good, and I think it's interesting because there've been a lot of there's been some work with kids, with toddlers who, prefer to share rather than prefer to be selfish, who have empathy early. And so, I mean, possibly too early to have learned it. I don't know. So the child development literature is really interesting on this topic. But I do think that there are several things that are important about being ethical. I think there's intuition, and I've talked to hundreds of scientists about how they or what they think about what ethical problems or what ethical things they think about come out in their research or in their work. Inevitably, most of them talk about human subject stuff, but a lot of them talk about things that they don't have a very formed vocabulary. So they say, some stuff just bothers me and I'm not really sure what to do about it. Or some stuff just seems wrong, but, everybody's doing it. Or, I really don't think there's really any problem until somebody says something about it. So they struggle for vocabulary. I think people intuit things well. I think we need to take advantage of that and help people recognize ethical issues, give them a vocabulary to discuss those, permission and a safe space to discuss those. And again, this idea that you can integrate ethical standards, ethical approaches to science early in the game, I think is really critical to bring it to the table. So I do think people can learn about how to recognize, identify, put voice to their concerns. We have to. It isn't optional anymore. We have to teach scientists how to do this. And the reason we have to do this is because they're increasingly, I mean, certainly this has been the case for over 20 years, but increasingly, science is done in a multidisciplinary environment. I mean, our neuroscience project that we're taking on, I mean, what is a neuroscientist? It's a person who does neuroscience. That's how people define, like, I'm a neuroscientist because I say I am one. I could be a psychologist, I could be a physician, I could be a biochemist, I could be a microbiologist, I could be a psychiatrist, I could be anything. And because I work on neuroscience, I'm a neuroscientist. So many different disciplines coming from many different ethical traditions, or worse, no ethical tradition. Yet these developments will have amazing implications. Not only will the research have pretty important research participant issues, but the societal implications are enormous. So, we've got to bring everybody to some baseline to at least have a vocabulary and the ability to kind of recognize what it is that's sitting in their craw and put words to that. So there isn't an option really anymore of, the typical, 1 hour a week survey class of how not to plagiarize that people get in graduate school. That's just not, we know that doesn't work. One of the things I find really surprising when I go out in the world and people say, oh, what do you do? And I say, I'm the executive director of the Presidential Bioethics Commission. So people, like, I'm on a plane, whatever. People usually ask me two questions. What is bioethics? Fair enough. And the second follow-up question is, why does the president have a committee for that or commission for that? And I think it's really telling that people don't recognize that there is, certainly people, when I tell them what bioethics is, they say something like, oh yeah, and I hear a story of how their mother, grandmother, child, something, cousin, had this medical dilemma. And that's a very clinical example. Most times people have a very personal relationship with an episode of ethics or clinical ethics. And then they say, well, so the question is then, what does the president have an ethics problem with his parent or with his, something? And so I feel like it's so important for all of us to have a better vocabulary, to have a better sense of why ethics matters to all of us, why science and the ethics of science matters to all of us. We talk a lot about science literacy and the lack of it in our country. And I think it's critical. I'm a scientist too, so I put that hat on. I say we need science literacy. I do think that we need ethics literacy too. And I think they should go together, just like they should go together for the scientist. I think that science and ethics literacy should go together for the public. And I really believe that a public body like a commission advising a president is in a perfect situation to do that. We do all our work in public. We're a federal advisory committee. So everything we do, all the deliberations of the commission are webcast and are done in public meetings. And they're fascinating and extremely, beautiful ways of getting to the root of an issue and to, bring up the process we use is democratic deliberation, and we bring up all these different voices and opinions and views on things. This is really an important way for the public to see not just about ethics and about science, but even to watch how people who disagree on some pretty fundamental things can come together. So something our country can use about any topic, but certainly about ethics, that people really believe is a very personal thing. There is a personal part of ethics. We all have a moral compass. But there is also ethics writ large is more about how we as a society are going to agree to move forward on these tough issues. And I really think public bioethics is something that this commission can contribute to and does.